All right. So as I mentioned, right, you have a holiday coming up, which is Monday. School will be closed, because the other section of 41A, they also have class on Monday. I felt like it's not fair for you if I require you to do another lab, and for them it's an extra credit. So we're gonna do an extra credit lab. It's optional attendance starting from next week, right? I will be here because I'm contracted, I'm paid to be here. I will be here to help you if you need some help or want to come in for the extra credit lab. Final exam, you're not required to come, but if you want to come in and use the computer to do that, you can. I believe that they have lockdown browser on these too. That's what IT team told me. But it will be open during the finals week, which is the second week of June. Um, and I will share the announcement with the final exam passcode. It will be a passcode exam for the final. Practice exam got unpublished because there's issue with automation with Canvas. Some of you heard this for the third time, right? I published it. I tried to fix it many times, and I thought I got it fixed. But the later questions, it didn't generate correctly based on my file. It just put in the same questions for the rest. So there's some issue with the automation with Canvas, but I will try to figure it out tonight. If not, I will manually put it into Canvas and be ready for you by Friday. So you should have approximately 3 weeks to address that. This is going to be our last required in-person session, right? It's been my pleasure to be your instructor, and I hope that you become successful in cybersecurity. You're always welcome to come back to my class, talk to my students, or take my classes, right? CIS41D online for summer. If you are going for the analyst certificate, it is available in the summer, and it is going to be assigned to someone else. She's going to teach the class in 6 weeks. It looks like I might be removed from 30B CIS for Python for networking. I will be teaching 30C. So if the enrollment for that is solid, if not, the non-credit courses, I will be here if some of my classes enrollment doesn't go. But today we're going to cover our last lecture and our last required lab, right? Oh, so sad. Okay, so in this week, we're going to review some of the concept we've been talking about since the beginning and also in the last few weeks, which is incident response, and then we're going to touch back on risk management. As you move on to some areas in cybersecurity, risk management is very important. And if you are doing graduate school, right, you will be required to take at least one risk management class because it really relates back to vulnerability and threats. And so we would start with chapter 14, and it talks about the response process. We've seen this before, right? Preparation, detection, analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, and some post-activity like reporting and the lesson learned. So to answer the questions, why is containment really a critical area in security? And especially when we're responding to an incident, right? Many of you will be working with Security Operations Center. Some of you will be working in maybe IT area that would have some kind of requirement in how you would address security problems. So when you're dealing with things like malware or attacks, right, we would really think about containment, because containment really means that we take that problem or the system that has the problem and we segregate it or isolate it from the rest. So that way things like malware doesn't spread across, right? As you know, ransomware can quickly be across multiple critical servers, or even in the case of attack, right? If they have gotten into one system, likely that they will be able to move across your network, and that is really the approach in that. So it really prevents the problem from further expanding and impacting the rest of the organization. So when we're looking at that, we physically isolate the system, like unplug the cable, or we can logically isolate the problematic system, like putting it on a virtual LAN environment, which uses a different set of IP addresses, so we'll subnet, and we can implement protection with that area, right? Like we will be able to keep it not connected to the network, or if it is connected to the network, we will put appliances or rules to make sure that it doesn't spread across. So it is a way that we can control, right, how that problem can escalate, right? It's really important to think about that. So you would start with containment. And we touched a little bit on VLAN, and I talked about this before. So typically, you would just have a layer 4 switch, right? A switch that might have many, many ports. And what you can do is you can configure it to allow specific ports. So for example, if we're looking at a 48 port switch, right? So this is a layer 4 switch. And you would connect to it using PuTTY or SSH. So you would access its configuration, right? You would create a VLAN, and in that configuration, your VLAN is treated as a separate network. Everything needs to be routed back, even though this switch is physically on the same rack as all your other switches, right? So the way that we can look at it, so let's think about it like this. My analogy is like, let's say you have a house, right? And you have many rooms and your family lives in this house. But let's say that we want to keep an area where it's isolated. So what you can do is you can build walls, right, to create a corridor, so that way there's a special way to enter and exit that area of your house. So it's exactly like that. In a network, it's like a house. What we want to do is we want to take a group of the ports. Let's say that I have maybe 4 or 5 servers that I want to isolate. I can take port 1 through 5, and I can group that into VLAN 1 and use VLAN 1 as a segmented area of my network, right? They would use specific IP addresses and subnet masks, and I would make sure that everything gets routed into that VLAN separately. Okay, that's very important. So you need to configure a route with that. Now, layer 4 switch also routes, right? So what you can do is you can create that area that keeps it in a separate part logically in your network, right? So that's important to think about. And what you can do is, this is how we can quarantine that part of the network. You can put firewall rules for that particular VLAN. You can have it inspect, you can do investigation. There's a lot of things that we can do in incident response that we talked about in the past, and that's important to think about, right? So you have to think about 2 areas. How am I going to physically isolate the system, and how am I going to be logically isolating the system? And that's important when you're responding to an incident. Any question? Keep touching the other mouse. Okay. So in your notes on page 1, it talks about containment. It gives you some example, right? That's your critical priority. That's typically the first thing when you are handling a highly impact, high priority incident. Then it touches on how, we can think about like what we can do with isolation of our system or segmenting our network. So let's take a look at this diagram real quick. It's not too detailed of a diagram. So what you can see is that you can see that this is your typical network, right? You have your service provider networks connecting, and you get things routed in. You have a border gateway firewall that's going to be your security guard, right, to your network. It's going to check what's coming in from the internet, what's leaving from your network, right? So you have this guard here. And so in this, we have 3 separate areas in our network, right? It's 3 segments. One is the data center network. Typically, that's housed with a service provider, like, cloud provider, unless the enterprise is able to accommodate that in-house, right? Like Stater Brothers, they have their own data center, HostBot, right? So then you got the employee network, which is your typical, workstations, printers, virtual machines, etc., to be able to have some operation for your organization. And then you have the guest network, right? That typically is like a wireless area. And so they don't mix because they have different data flow and different level of privacy and security in their data. So take that, and if we implement some kind of quarantine, right? Let's say that I have some form of attack, right, happening in different parts of my network. Let's say the data center. You would take that group of system, configure that logically on the switch, and you would add another virtual LAN or another logical network, right? And you want to isolate those systems so you can inspect, right? Like we can do investigation with it. We can monitor network activity. We can check the logs. We can spend more time without utilizing a lot of the bandwidth across these other areas of the network, right? Or having an impact, especially when we're looking at malware or attacks. So this is a way that we can see, right? We can visualize how that can be added. But you want it, the switch, those ports, so the switch is going to transmit everything back into your border gateway firewall. Why? Because everything is still going to enter and exit through that corridor with the security guard, right? Everything is going to go into that and leaving from that. Okay? So you want to connect that switch back and making sure that it gets routed and sent back to the firewall. Now, another way that you can do this, if it was my implementation, I would keep this completely separate and I would have a specific smaller appliance connecting here. The reason why is I don't want things to be mumble jumble back up here, because if they can get into this area and override your firewall, it's open sesame, right? So if they can get into here, that means that eventually they will find a way into here. So I would keep the route completely separate. It's kind of like you have a separate detour for those special traffic, right? Just to make sure that they don't interfere with the others. Okay, any question? Okay, so we addressed on how to do segmentation. I think we touched on that also in the past. And so the two techniques that we typically see for isolating an incident when we're responding to it is to isolate the affected systems, right, and isolate the attacker. Because typically when we're looking at a form of attack, it is a user or a subject acting on an object, right? In access, that's what we typically see, right? If it's a valid user account that's identified, that's a subject acting on an object. So that means that we would take that object and we would isolate it from the rest of our network, and we would take that user account. So you should ask me, why? How can I isolate the user, right? That user account might be in a group. If they are using if they fish out the account information, you can remove that user from the group, disassociate the membership, disable the account immediately, right? As soon as you have some kind of notification or you see something obscure in the log, you can disable the account. And instead of deleting the account, we don't want to delete the account because that deletes files that we need to investigate with. So we want to isolate the account, right, from the rest of our group of users. Okay. Now that's going to help us determine, right, even in the case where if the attacker is leveraging some resources within and vulnerability to circumvent our systems, then we would be able to see both areas. Okay. So the two things that you need to take away as an analyst is that for isolation. Now, containment, we typically think of containment as a way to quarantine something, right? To lock something up, to separate them, right? But in some cases we can remove. Okay. Nowadays, if you're looking at malware, it's typically harder to remove that actual malware because the way that they write the source code is it's really dive deep into your system file, or it impacts a lot of the files that you need for your operating system or your software to work, right? But in some cases, if you're looking at, like, let's say a physical incident, right? Like somebody is committing a threat, right? Or it could be a human behavior where that subject can be removed completely from the facility. So in some cases we can remove, and that might be the most effective way to make sure that there's no further impact. Okay. Any question? Okay. So question number 5 asks you, what should be considered when pursuing attacker identification? In a lot of cases, right, unlike what you've seen with Canvas and ransomware in the recent case, the group that did it apparently want you to know, right? Want the company to know that they did it, right? But in a lot of cases, the attacker identity is hidden because they need to be part of your network in order to, right, to access the resource. That means that they have to mask IP addresses and MAC addresses and use a valid user, right? Or access an administrator account to create a valid user. So that means that, you know, looking back to what we talked about, how we should isolate the attacker, sometimes that can be harder to identify, right? But in a sense where if the company wants to identify the attacker to pursue, right? So ethically, we don't attack back, okay? And that doesn't not always the practice in technology and cybersecurity for some organization, right? Some organization they allow that, right? But however, ethically, we don't attack back. When we identify the attacker, it's really is a way to making sure that that doesn't happen again, right? We can pursue them with legal aspect, but we don't pursue with doing the same thing to them as they do to us. Okay, so the aspect that you need to think about is the business value and how this plays into incident response. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that we really enforce in cybersecurity might be stopped in the business area, right? We talked about containment, eradication, recovery activities, and so on. So when you're identifying the attacker as a threat, let's say that you bring that forward to your IT manager or your CISO and say that I found this, right? It shows in the log that this particular account has been leaking data, right, in our systems, from our system into their network, for example. And what they do is they assess the risk based on the business value. Okay, is it really worth it to pursue, right, additional process in the incident response? Is it what is the impact level, right? Just like what you think about, like, why did instructor pay that ransomware, right? $10 million.
Went up?
Yeah, I thought it was 5, but it's 10. They officially announced 10 million, right? So, but if you think about that, 900 schools, right? Millions of users, you can have potentially the maximum lawsuits can be a lot more than $10 million, right? So they come back to the business value. Now, the attacker in that case already identified themselves. Here we are. This is what you need, right? This is what you need to pay us. But they need to really respond back and say, okay, we need to stop that from happening again and recover from that. And they did. They have like 30 something hours that bounce back, right? A lot of schools roll back on Friday. We waited until Monday because, you know, they wanted to investigate. Yeah.
So is this communication happening in like a sandbox environment or like dark web environment?
Oh, for the exchange?
Yeah.
There's not a lot of, so it apparently, right? They posted that page that you saw, right? They had contacted the instructor and there's a demand. Usually when you see ransomware, there's some form of message. So they use encrypted message format typically so that way you can't trace that. That would ask for a certain amount and it's coming through now cryptocurrency because it's harder to trace, right? And then that gets transferred into some kind of accounts overseas, I would assume. So originally their PR said that there was a settlement for an undisclosed amount, but a few days later they disclosed it was $10 million. So and they the attacking group provided evidence that the data was not in the dark web, right? And it's been shredded. So it was approximately 3 to 4 terabytes. For 900 schools, that's not a lot though. Right? But if you look at it, it's just a few columns in the database where they can pull that. So it could be that time or constraint that they were not able to pull the rest of the data. That could be maybe more valuable. I don't know. Right? So in the it's a browser injection technique that they're able to access, and also there is access to specific account, and that's disclosed on the internet. Frequent teacher was a vulnerability in Canvas, so there was a floating account that has privilege to other areas, and so they traverse through and look for the typical account to access, and that's how they found an area to go.
So them like announcing the amount or whatever, is that because by law or that's just because they won't be able to?
I don't know if it's their PR team, but it was sources on the internet that provided that information, and the media picked it up and they published all over, right? Because a lot of people were interested in how much I thought it was so 10 million was and they paid up on the day of the deadline. So but yeah, so when you look at the business value in that, right, the weight in whether they should pay or they should not pay. So in responding and going through the process, right, you would see that manager is going to make the decision, and typically it might not be best for all parties, right? So you're gonna lose some, you're gonna win some, so you're gonna see some of that, and that's the indication for number 5. So let me move 5 now, or I should have moved the other ones up. All right. So we talked about isolating and containment. We talked about removal in containment, but let's talk about the purpose of eradication. Eradication really indicates removal. It is a way that we can extract something from a certain area, right? But in eradication for incident handling, we touched on this in the last unit, where we would look at like malware, or we would look at the attack. When you are eradicating the in the incident area, that means that you need to also remove the artifacts. Now, going back to what we talked about, there are some factors that you have to consider. Regulation is a big decision maker. Making area, right? What's required by the law, and you have federal regulation, you also have state regulation. So I'm going to give you an example, right? California have privacy laws that are different than some state, and so in the case where there's a breach or there's a leak, right? Depending on the industry that you operate in and the compliance need, right? You're gonna have to do some kind of report. Typically, we report to law enforcement, right? In the case like Canvas, they need to report to FBI because it becomes a federal, because it's cybercrime. But when you remove artifacts, right, those artifacts can be important in potentially existing case or future areas of the case. So we talked about data retention and artifact retention. That's important. But for 6 to remove any artifacts from the incident, that can also impact the outcome of the incident or the legal aspect of the incident. So make sure that if you are authorized to do that, right, get it documented and making sure that, there's like potentially it doesn't come back to you. So that's important to think about. Okay. It's like deleting some of the things that we have discovered or found through forensic or based on the incident or logs, stuff like that. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. So before we talk about recovery, right? So isolation, we talked about the two areas here. Okay. Removal. So something to think about in identifying your threat. We've been talking about this for a while. We know that logs is going to contain all the activities that the system has gone through, all the activity, right? But typically the identity of the user and the system is very apparent. The address is like what I've told you, right? And one thing that really ties everything back is the network, right? How they come in is through the network. The network is going to tell you all the story, right? Your network captured, just like how when you look at the malware, right, where it comes from, who downloaded it at what time. So everything that you need to piece together typically comes back to the network monitoring capture. And you would see how it gets routed in, right? Which system that the user, that particular unauthorized user is accessing from. And then from there, you can get deeper into the logs. So some of the business might say, you know what? It happens, right? We'll just report it. It happens. We won't invest a lot of money into it because there's no ROI on it. There's no return on investment. If we're going to spend thousands of dollars to really fix this problem, our data is already breached. We're just gonna, potentially we might have some lawsuits and that's that, right? And this is what you see with cases with communication company and many company at large, right? So they would look at the business value and they would say, oh, it happened to us. We lost this much. We will just pay for the user to monitor their credit score, or we will change privacy policy, inform the user. We might have a class action that will cost us $3 million, but we're not going to spend $10 million to fix the problem, or $8 million to fix the problem. So you weight the difference, and their risk manager would look at that and say, okay, this is the risk, and this is the value of this risk, and this is the risk, and this is the value of that. So different consideration in your solution overall. Okay, eradication is on page 5, right? But you really need to understand what is the root cause. How did this problem become, right? Where did that come from? How did they get in, right? What had happened? And so root cause analysis is really coming back to vulnerability assessment in many cases, right? So when you look at malware, when you look at attacks, when you look at data breach, right, it's either weakness in system, right, services, or users, okay? Those are like the main 3 areas that we typically see that would be contributing to the root cause of the problem, okay? Because if there's not a problem, cybersecurity professional, the profession itself will not be as big as it is today, right? So we're always chasing this. Okay. In the next question, for 7, it asks you, what is the critical element when implementing secure recovery to correct control deficiencies that led to the original attack, right? We talked about the cases with Candace. right? They had gone through and they investigate like, where did that problem come from? Where's the vulnerability? And I had told you, right, there was an account all over the internet they have published, and I'm sure that you can probably read about it. What would be the vulnerability? So there's more vulnerability to that infrastructure than what just one account. Okay. Injection capability, web application assessment, a lot of the things, the components, the API, things like that is not carried into it in a secure way. So that means that you really need to come back to like where the problem lies first and how it became a problem. Okay. So you will need to perform a lot of vulnerability assessment, sometimes manually looking through things and finding out like why it happens, how it happens, what causes it. So in recovery, this is how we're going to put things back into operation, right? When you have a breach, you are going to have data loss. You are going to have a loss in cost because of operation, right? In retail cases, when your systems are down, you already lose some sales. So, but you have to think about like how much data you're putting back, right? How much time do you need? Right? What kind of service you need? And when you roll that, you should always expect a little buffer time. So that means that in the recovery phase, you would typically make sure that you fix the vulnerability before you roll it back. So even in your backup, it has that vulnerability. So as you roll that backup, you need to fix that vulnerability. You need to potentially reconfigure some security area, like your firewall rules, right? How did the attacker get in? Maybe some rules are we're not able to screen, right, a specific type of traffic. If it's a malware issue, right, make sure that you look back into how the malware is not detected. So that means that your anti-malware might need some fix. And then bringing back the services. So now time constraint, typically most business, right? You see 24 hours is the most in their RTO. But like I said, it could be a huge, right? A huge attack where it impacted many systems. And if your failover cluster is housed in a specific area where you don't have access to it, that can be a long process. But your failover cluster should mirror exactly what your original is if you have a hot side. So for something that is an online service like instructor, right? They should have something that's exact mirror. But you consider when was the last time they back up, right? Did you really experience a lot of data loss? It might be very minute. Also because the type of data that was accessing the attack. So if they have updated, they have done the backup like maybe an hour before the attack, right? You might just lose that 1 hour of data. So you have to assess that as an analyst. Even when you do live like backup, right? Minutes and seconds, sometimes you are gonna have some fraction of loss. Okay. So we talked about fixing some of the things as we go through the recovery process. When we rebuild the images. So image contains software like operating system applications that are running and all their services and data that contain on that system. So if you back up the image really is a way that we look at that system state, right, at that moment in time. So that way, when we recover from the backup, we rebuild it. We put the software back, we put the services back, we put the data back. So rolling back to the images that we had, typically you back up the images and back up the data for those systems, right? So depending on how big your system, how much data, how large is the actual event or the incident. So that can be lengthy. Not everything can be sometime rolled back in 24 hours. Sometimes it would take more than 24 hours. Or sometimes you need to be back on within hours, right? Like 2, 3 hours. Because other than that, you would just lose too much money. In the case of something like Amazon, for sure. Like if you're a worldwide retailer. Okay. But in that even when you roll back the images, you put it back. And when you do the backup might take you 4 hours, but recover, you already know if you ever try to recover Windows system, it's taking a long time, right? So it has to unpack the backup file and put everything back into place. So you are gonna have longer than 4 hours. Okay. Yeah, I used to also be a backup technician for a pharmaceutical company. So we did like database backup, which contains like inventory for all the retailer along with formulas, um, ingredients that would construct a certain form of medications for their manufacturing division. And so when I come in, I would do the backup at night, put it in the catalog. At the time, a lot of companies were using hard drive. So I would mirror the drive, send some of the drives to an offsite location with the local backup and also a set of server backup, right? So when I get a call after I've done the backup, typically it's because either they have a crash or something had happened. So I would need to go in and set up their technician to be able to roll back the images and the data. Sometimes it's just the data, sometimes it's actual system images and so on. And you would use software tools to be able to do that outside of just your OS tool. It's definitely streamlined the process a lot quicker. But yeah, my experience with it is typically a lot longer, sometimes twice as long as what you see with the backup. Okay, so we touched on that. On reconstruction and reimaging, you can find this on the bottom of 5. And this area didn't really was not added to your Q&A for your assignment, but it talks about patching and your application. Okay. So when you are in this process, a lot of the times we always think about like, oh, it's the rest of our systems and it's all the systems are in operation, but you really need to focus on the systems that are impacted, right? First, and you work outward. So that means that let's say I have 2 servers that were attacked, right? I would focus on rebuilding those 2 servers. And then let's say those are file servers, or now that's called storage servers. Then I would think about like the next part is to make sure that I patch and fix and check the configuration of the system that are connected to those 2 servers. So you work outwards. Okay. And then after that, we would scale out. Maybe the client systems that are authenticated to access files on those storage servers and the affiliates, right? So you would start with the compromised system and then the systems that are connected to them, and then client system or endpoints and so on. Okay. So in the next question, you can refer to page 6. It asks about how do you properly dispose media, and that can include USB, micro SD, SSD, HDD, right? Anything that has files or information about your employee, your organization, private information. We want to approach it with the 3 steps: clear, purge, and destroy, right? In a lot of cases, what you see is you have to clear out the data. Deleting data, we already talked about this last week, just means that it put things back into the Slack space. Someone can use tools to be able to read that, right? When you zero out the data, sometimes you have to zero it out multiple times so you can purge it. And then a lot of the times they also physically destroy the media, right? You know, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they typically burn things because we use a lot of printout paper product. But you typically see that they have punching type of system that punch through the hard drive. Nowadays, a lot of companies dispose products physically where they actually destroy it. So if you need to dispose of micro SD, don't just toss it into the trash. Even if it doesn't work anymore, you need to break it, right? Physically break it to pieces where it doesn't work anymore. Okay. I had visited one of the labs in San Diego for data recovery one time. They used to charge like a lot, even like for 2 gig of data, they would charge like, uh several $1,000s to be able to rebuild that. Sometimes they would take apart hardware to be able to extract, and they have like equipments to do that electronically. Um, so I have seen things that were apart and they were able to pull some data from it, right? So you'll be amazed on, some of the technology and tools and resources that people can use to be able to pull data. Okay, so after you have recovered, you would need to go through and validate that you have proper accounts accessing your recovered system, right? With those accounts that would relate to privilege and permissions for the data, and privilege is for the system access, right? The level of access in that system. So make sure you go through and do the audit. And making sure, because this can also generate another area of vulnerability. So you don't want that to happen. Okay. And then making sure that the system are recording all the activity. So your logs, because in a lot of the attacks, logs get corrupted or deleted or modified. So making sure that you have proper logs in the right area. And then having that in the repository, like servers, or backup somewhere. And then ultimately that would require you to do some pen testing again. So you would come back and look for vulnerability. So you want to assess the vulnerability of the restored system so that way you can close out future or additional security gaps, right? We fix the current problem. We want to identify potential problems so that way it doesn't happen again or it doesn't escalate. Because if the attacker gets away with doing it, likely that they will try to revisit. And that's in the case of many companies, Target, Verizon, T-Mobile. You've seen multiple attacks that happen, Yahoo. So, because they already identify some of the existing vulnerability and found new vulnerabilities, that's how they're able to return. Okay, so you saw earlier that there's an ending requirement to your incident response. We talked about this before, right? You need to be able to provide the report. As an analyst, you have to do that, right? And then having the change control processes, because there were change made, right, in our system through the actual after event in handling the incident. And then write up on what you've learned and what needs to be improved. And then you need to make sure, we talked about this last time, to retain your artifacts, potentially for maybe future use, right? Because things might come back legally. Until it's no longer required, then you can remove it. Okay. Any question regarding incident response? I think we touched a lot on this in the last. Next, we are going to come back to risk assessment. I know that you probably heard about this many, many times, and you will continue to hear about it because all of these things come back to risk management, right? Vulnerability, threats. And then in analyzing these, you really correlate that to different level of risk. So it is known that if a business doesn't have a business impact analysis plan, a BIA, that they will not be successful after 2 or 3 years of operation. Research been done many years, right? So if you're looking at like a lot of the business, they need to have some kind of continuation plan, basically, right? If they're coming across issue, how are they going to really look at that issue, assess it, fix it, and then move on, right? So BIA really focused back on how we are addressing the risk to be able to continue in operation as a business. Okay. Now, in that, we look at risk assessment in 2 areas, qualitative and quantitative. A lot of cases you are going to see in this profession, you are going to use both. So qualitative typically comes through like medium, low, high, some kind of label that you give to represent a level of your risk. Okay. Where quantitative, where we would use numerical calculation, in my perspective, quantitative speaks more to me in how I make a decision or how I help a business make a decision. Because, like you said, we look at business value, which comes back to dollars. Okay. So, in a lot of cases, we quantify how much that risk costs us, right? Just like how when they're looking at hiring someone that can potentially be a risk, right? In that decision, when they do the investigation, the background check, and they say, oh, there's a flag for this person. Should I hire this person? And then they look at the investment behind this person and what the potential contribution for that person into the company. And that's how they determine whether they should hire that person, right? And so when we look at technology, it's the same thing. If we are adopting that technology, does it have some kind of return on investment value, right? And how long? We can quantify that to 5 years, which is the lifespan of the technology. But is there any additional impact or factor that we need to consider, right? So those are some of the things that you need. And now because you have access to AI can give you different prediction, right? Based on the model that you can say, okay, if I go with this decision A, it will be like this and it will cost me this much, where decision B, it will be like this and it will cost me a little bit different, right? So you have variation in mock-up on how you approach your risk. But in this profession, you need to at least calculate the basic, okay? So before we do number 12, right? So risk you see here, where it is an overlapping between threats and vulnerability. So first, you need to identify your risk in risk management. And with that, we would calculate. So when you get, some of you are going to Cal State San Bernardino, some of you might be doing your master's in cybersecurity now, soon, I don't know, right? You're going to see something like this a lot. This is metrics, right? It's typically is a table that we do correlation in the level of your risk. So if you qualify low, medium, or high, it's like this, right? Sometimes you would have more levels. So let's say that I have 3 levels. You qualify the magnitude here. And in this table, you would put down the type of risk, right? And that really comes back to your threats and your vulnerability, right? So, for example, in this case, right, when we're looking at this, and across here is the probability. It's also qualified in low, medium, or high. Now, if I need to quantify this is going to be numerical scale, right? 0 to 100%. And it's going to land somewhere here, here, or here, right? You can graph that out. But so in this case, when you're looking at data center intrusion, this is a high magnitude. but the probability is low. That means that their data center is well secured and protected, right? But the area that we need to fix is right here on the right. The magnitude is high and the probability is high. Okay. So when you identify your risk, you also, after that, you need to assess, right? What is the probability of this occurring? Right? What is the magnitude of it? And then you place it onto the matrix. Okay. And so with this, solid unencrypted device and spear phishing, we need to fix this area. And so if we qualify this, we know that it's high here and it's high here, it's priority. So the solution for this is that you can come up with something like, oh, we need to make sure that we implement encryption when people plug their USB in. As soon as when they're trying to detach their USB, it automatically encrypts their USB. So if they drop their USB on the way to the bathroom, our data is not, right? It's not going to be impacted. It's not going to be leaked. And then with spear phishing, right, user training, user awareness program, we can control things like email filtering. We can monitor. There's a lot of different elements that you need to implement. And then we will qualify that or quantify that to, you know, whether the solution is effective or not, to the dollars or cents, too, right? Okay. So now we know how to qualify. And then we're going to quantify. So in quantitative risk assessment, you start with assets value. Always do inventory of what you have, right? So what's considered an asset? Systems or things or people that is worth more than $500. I say people because people are assets, but employees are assets. But let's say we talk about a computer, right? The capital value has to be over a certain amount that's considered a solid asset investment. So when you have a workstation, for example, they cost $2,000, right? That's going to be your asset value, right? Can data be asset? Sure, right? Data is quantified differently. It really is, you know, like the content of the data, the usability of the data, you know, different areas of the data that's considered assets. So some sets of data is worth more and some sets of data is not. Because a lot of people say, oh, Social Security is worth a lot. It depends, right? So when they leak your data, the data sets is really how clean is the data, how usable is the data. Those are typically the question is the worth of your data. And how much it is to rebuild that data in organization, right? If I need to start from 0 to be able to put that data back, how much is it going to cost me to put that data into the system? Okay, so you would start with the AV, and then you need to calculate your annual rate of occurrence. So let's do the next step together. Okay, so a company has 2 incidents per month impacting 2 desktops. Could be vandalism, theft, right? Not this close, right? First, we want to calculate the assets value, annualized rate of occurrence, ARO, single loss expectancy, SLE, and to be able to determine the level of risk. So when you have 2 incidents per month, that means that there are 24 occurrences in a year, right? We take 2, we multiply it by 12 months, we get 24. So your ARO value is 24. Let's say that you look back at the inventory list and you saw that the desktop, when it was purchased, it was $2,500. Okay, that's going to be your assets value. But wait, you have to consider depreciation value. If this desktop is a year old, you have to subtract the year depreciation, right? So I didn't calculate that in here. I just assumed that this is a brand new system that is happening to it, right? So when you're replacing that system, you have to spend $2,500, right? But as your system age, a lot of the times there's depreciation value where you have to, and then also like it might go up because it contains the data inside it, right? So there's like a lot of things that we have to add to the calculation beyond this. This is the very basic we would start with, right? So 2 systems were impacted. So you take $2,500, that's the worth of the system, the worth of the assets. You multiply it by 2, so your impacting assets cost $5,000 per month. So that means that your single loss expectancy is $5,000, right? For the 2 incidents. Your SLE. Now we need to then quantify that out to the year. So if each month we lose $5,000, and in a year we lose $60,000, not considering data, a lot of other things. Okay, the services that goes into recovering the system after the loss, you see? So $60,000 is the base. It's more than $60,000 after. Okay, so another way that you can calculate it is you can look at the impacting assets, right? Or the AV value, which is 2,500, and then you can multiply it by 24 because of the ARO. So you take the ARO times the AV, you also get $60,000. Make sure we know this to do this for the final exam. I will expect you to know how to calculate. It's based on the given value.
Question.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think ARO, the asset value for one
Computer.
ALE is annual, so yearly.
Mm-hmm.
Then wait, what's our SLE?
Single loss expectancy.
So that
Because each loss is 2 incidents per month. It's double the AV. Your AV is only 1 computer, but there's 2 computers that are impacted.
5 times 2.
No, 2,500 times 2.
Oh wait.
That's your impacting assets in those instances.
Right, impacting assets is my SLE.
Yeah, because this is the assets for the incident.
Oh, okay, because I'm trying to create like.
Yeah. Good question, right? So your SLE single loss expectancy is $5,000 because there's 2 systems that were impacted. I should say systems to make it's less confusing. And then this is also known as ALE for those of you who want to remember the acronym. If you're studying for a security plus, you need to know this too. So each year, right, we're expected to lose at least $60,000. I would, for calculation for me, I would also add in like, we have to quantify the data for that too, like I said.
So AV is 5,000 and SLE is 5,000.
Yeah, single loss expectancy. So for that incident, we lose $5,000. And then in the year, because there's 2 systems or 2, right? So that's going to be 24 times 2,500. Okay, so for the description, right, of these acronyms, you can go down to page 10. Now, the whole point in qualifying and quantifying is to be able to determine, right, the type of mitigation that we're going to implement. So I can reduce the risk. So what can I do with this problem, right? So let's assume that there are a few things that are happening to our computers, right? Like theft. People just walk out with workstation and take it home and never bring it back, right? So we can implement something like we can secure it to the actual desk, right? And that might not cost us very much. You can bolt things down, which takes your technician an hour at the most to do, and then the equipment to do it, like tools and nuts and bolts, right? You can also chain them down, so buy a lock and chain, right? But locks can be cut. But apparently, if you are surveying your facility, we can install cameras. So there's like a lot of other implementation, and you would wait, right? Like, so if we lose 5,000 a month, and if we spend $500 on the tools and things to lock it down, right? We reduce that risk, and we would accept it because 500 versus $5,000 a month, right? And in the long run, we would save a lot more money. So that's why when you quantify it, sometimes it is very clear. Now, you know how sometimes people in United States, right? Let's say convenience store, retail store, when people come in and they steal things, right? Sometimes companies don't pursue it, right? They tell the security guard to not handle it, but have the police officer comes, right? They might have evidence. It depends on what they take, and that comes back to risk assessment, right? If it's so small, a lot of the times they don't want to put in the effort to really pursue, like if they're stealing a pen or a pencil, right? Something small, right? Because in small theft kind of cases, typically that person is charged with like at most $500, and then it goes to different type of court. But in the cases where it is a larger thing that they're stealing, then that might be work for the company to pursue, right? So that is also something to think about in your loss, especially physical loss in cybersecurity. Your business value. Okay, let's bring her down. Okay, any question? Okay, so before we get into the NIST section, right? In risk mitigation, sometimes you cannot mitigate the risk. You just have to accept it, because in the case where we don't have security control for it, or we don't have a way to fix it, even in some vulnerability, right? You know that a lot of these vulnerabilities been around for a long time, and it takes time to research and build technology to be able to have that control or fix the problem. So immediately, sometimes you would have to accept the risk in even on the higher level, right? But we want to quantify it so that way we know the expectation is that if it happens, right, this is how much we're gonna lose, or this is how much we pay. Versus if you don't know and then you ended up losing a lot more. So it is a good way to prepare in the case that it happens. And I think in cybersecurity, it's about that, right? Being proactive in cybersecurity is having a high level of preparation. That's it. Compared to not being prepared and then just get wiped out, right? Like you can see a business can definitely go under in the case that when they're facing high risk and they're not able to bounce back, for sure. It sounds like a business class, but IT is the operation for business. So, okay, let's get into NIST publication. Will you see NIST stuff on a lot of certification? Not so much. A lot of it is for your practice. It's important to know about this in the case that you have to work with it. In the case that you have to be able to provide guidance to the people who need to use it. So, and also interview, they might ask you about NIST. So NIST is an organization that provides resources in the industry, if you're not familiar with it. In our world, typically we would use the 800 series, and each documentation gives us guidance, right? Guidelines on what to do. So if you're new, you don't know, or you're not familiar with the area that you need to fix, right? You can go to NIST publications and be able to find some guidance and you can start there. Okay. This is so different than what you see when I first started, right? For many of us who started long ago, this really is a way that we can build it so that way the community can utilize the resource to improve. Um, it and the contribution in this is over time, right? You would see that there's change in technology and it's also change in the guidance in how to handle these technology. So we would start with the 800-30. This is going to give you risk assessment information and guidance and how to manage it, right? So if you want to refer to risk assessment, you can go to this documentation. You can go to the NIST website and search for it. Yes. You don't memorize. You can search for it on their website, right? But you would start with the 800, right? And then you can go through. In with the professional, like when you get to the consultant level, when you use it over time, it's easier to remember, right? Just like how you would know that we would use certain resources for certain things in our daily life, okay? Then you have the internet and AI, right? You have these tools at your hand to use. But on an interview, you want to make sure that you at least, if you don't know, pretend to tell them that you know, right? So you know, you don't memorize it. So, but you need to know, like, oh, you would say I would go to this website and I would be able to search for one of the documents in the 800 series where it would give me guidance on how to handle different type of security processes or, practices and so on. Anyway, the 37 gives you the 7 steps in managing privacy risk. So for us, I think this is the area that we're looking at quite a bit, relating to data leak, relating to, how to be able to secure the systems that hold privacy, how that information is shared. So a lot of the larger company technology, they face a lot of lawsuits with privacy, that, they have shared your data with another entity and you're not authorizing them to do that. So now there's law that has passed that you can opt out on that. You don't have to, if you use that service, you don't have to give everything about you, right, privately to the company that's indirect to you. Right. So let's say I use Google and Google is affiliate with another company through service, right? I don't have to share my information with that third company or that third entity. Okay, the 53 has controls on how to use cybersecurity framework, and we'll talk a little bit about the framework. So let's say that I don't know how to implement security solutions. Security solution encompasses control. We have control for everything. Control for the network, control for system, control for user, right? Control for applications, hardware, software, accounts, everything, right? So, and it divides up to 20 families or categories, so that way you can look at, right? And some control are overlapping. Okay. So I give you the link, right? If you can take a look at it, or you can search online for it. If you are interested in a 37, right? This is for management framework. So when you get into management position, you would deal with a lot of this, but let's say if you're the analyst that has to refer to this documentation to implement certain practices or certain configuration, yeah, you can go to the guidance for that. Okay.
Now, some industry or some regulation requires certain documentation. So, for example, FISMA requires that you have to implement some controls from this documentation. There's no way around it, right? So you have to refer to the control on the list to be able to implement that. And you have to show that because through the audit, they will determine whether you meet that criteria or not. Okay. 15, which publication gives you guidance in handling PII, right? So 800-122 gives you the basic practical in how you would identify personal identifiable information. I always recommend looking at the industry you're in and the compliance body like HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, PCI DSS. So depending on the type of information that you hold, so healthcare requires different form of protection in privacy compared to financial systems, or students like for FERPA, or underage students. So when you work with K through 12, it's also a different area, right? Because they need to be protected, especially for identity, pertaining to the underage group. And so, but the 122 give you some context on how to work with PII. And then you also need to refer to state regulation, right? Like each state would have a certain requirement on, where that information can go, what is the extent of that information can be shared. Because let's say that when you're looking at healthcare, like a physician can refer a patient to another physician, like a specialist, for diagnosis, right? But if you're looking at from the time that you go see a doctor to the time that you go to the pharmacy, your information is shared across the provider, right? Your insurance, your diagnosis, your medication, right? It goes from one network to the next network. And in the back, we have to look at like how that is protected in comparison to, like, for example, also, right? I was at Costco yesterday and I was walking around and they were like, oh, do you want to make a car key? You can pay Costco and then we'll give you an additional car key, right? And I was like, oh, they have all of these vendors. I'm sure you've seen like companies that have partnership for air conditioning, right? Mobile communications. And so with that, their customer information is shared, like credit card information, transaction, like how do they know, right? The transaction record that I pay Costco for that product that doesn't belong to Costco, right? So handling that across the system, we have to have some form of protection. And where does that go to? To what extent, right? And then the customer have to authorize that, or do they, right? In some state you don't. So all right. Now, if you're using virtualization like Hyper-V, VMware, let's say that I have my employee log into their system and every time they log in, it's going to pull a virtual instance. So that way they would have their custom desktop, their application, because I have different type of employees. Also files that they created, right? So with that, there is guidance on how to have security implementation for virtualization technology. And even with cloud, you have a lot of virtual environment for using cloud, which is just remote servers. Okay. So if you see like Hyper-V, vSphere, stuff like that, products like that is going to need some security protection. And you would refer to documentation 125. Okay, so as you look through, right, the ending part of this is to really come back to NIST. Now, if you work for the DoD, some of you got the scholarship at Cal State San Bernardino. They might send you to do some work with the agency or companies that contract with DoD. So they are required to fulfill specific requirement for security here, which is controlling information in non-federal systems and organizations. So your contractor who is not federal, like Raytheon, Northrop, right? Like they work with the military and the agency, but their system is not owned by the agency. Sometimes it's supplied, then it's owned by the agency. So you have to look at the compliance to the requirement, the process for that on how you transmit that information across the systems that are not owned by DoD. I told this story on Monday, but one of the first grant that I work here at NBC was to help smaller company that works for the DoD or contract with the DoD with interns, right? And the interns are supposed to look at this area to be able to build that out. So for example, one of the companies I mentioned that they had a breach when that happened, right? Built black box for military planes, right? And it's such a small company, but with that, they don't have a lot of information. They have designs and engineering design on their systems, right? And they use that for DoD products. So we have to look at like how the information is stored because the engineering design can play an important key because it's proprietary for that particular contract. So when you work with agencies and government type of organization, you have to use specific documentation. And then there's federal agency use of the cybersecurity framework. So let's go to the next few questions. So the core of your cybersecurity framework entails identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. Very similar to what we saw with IRP processes earlier, right? We identify the threat and the vulnerability, right? And usually that indicates that we would need to detect it, right? Where is that happening? Which system? We touched a lot about that earlier. Then we would go through the isolation process or the containment, right? And then to be able to protect, okay, to implement some security solution or fixes to make sure that we respond to it accordingly and mitigate that risk so that way we can go back to where we were and improve from that as well, right? So the 5 core will really represents like how we look at like the incidents that would entail the risk. Okay. So the objective of the framework I give you here in bullets. And the model, the way that we can look at this is to really help organization in different tier on how to implement security solutions. So that way they can at least meet the standard, right? Or be above the standard. Okay. And the functions, the categories, subcategories, and formative sources, you can find the information on page 12 and 13. So let's talk about the tier. So based on this cybersecurity framework implementation, there are 4 tiers that's going to really correlate with the organization security practices. Okay. Let's say that I own a small business and I don't have a lot of money and I don't have very much security in place, right? I'm going to be in tier 1 because that's not really my priority, right? A lot of the money might be really invested into my operation for profit purposes. outside of, I don't have the resource for protection at this time, right? I don't have the staff to do that. I might have a company that just mainly service my computers and maybe like transactional systems. I also signed a contract for that. Many companies do that, right? So they would be part of tier 1. It's called partial. Now, tier 2 is where they have a little bit in place, right? There's some risk plan, but they don't really have enough resources to be able to handle the incidents like an enterprise level, or fix all of the problem, right? So it's kind of like a little bit better than tier 1, but not exactly the best. This is just to fulfill regulation requirement, right? They get by. And they don't have major incidents happening to them yet, right? So not a huge concern yet, right? Then you have the tier 3, which is repeatable. And so you do have some best practices in security. You have some remediations, and also risk and threat management capability there, right? So this is more fleshed out compared to the last tier because they have the resources to do that. Okay. Now, in a lot of the tech company in the Fortune 500 company, you see that they're at adaptive level. That means that they're able to handle security measures and potentially become more proactive in cybersecurity. They will look at the risk behaviors and be able to address that before it becomes a major risk. And so that way, I really feel like this is the level that would entail a lot of resources, right? So enterprise that have the resources, you're gonna see that they're adaptive. And they also able to adapt new technology and be able to handle security risks behind the technology as well. Okay. So the tier that consists of just knowing about your risk and having some kind of planning to respond to your risk is tier 2, right? It's still at the beginning, but you are at least know that your risk exists. Okay. So when you're looking at the organization, you ask yourself, what is the existing security measure, right? Which tier are they at? Because that's going to help you come back to like, how are you going to be able to implement the solutions if they have nothing, right? So then you have to start from ground zero. But if they have something, you can build upon, their risk awareness and be able to look at their resources and how they respond to it. So what exists really helps in how we would implement the framework profile. Okay. There's more documentation. So in this profession, like I said, the SP800, that's your world, okay? Also, you can refer to the SP1800. This is the practice guides for cybersecurity. But in IT itself, it is the SP500, right? So the cybersecurity area, it really addresses security measure, controls, privacy, a lot of the things we talk about, where information technology is more on like maintenance and configuration and just operation overall. Sorry, the last few is kind of long. Like I said, you don't have to put verbatim. You can summarize it. You can clip it from, I should have just moved this down. Yeah, because it's lengthy. Okay. So for federal agency, or supply chain for federal agency. So if you're looking at like, let's say, DoD or the military, right? They buy products to be able to support their operation. Simple products to more complex products, right? Sometimes would be warfare related products, or sometimes it's national security products. So if you refer to SP 853, we have to meet these activities. Okay. Number one, we need to categorize the data. That means that you have to determine the classes of your data or the type of your data that you're working with. Is it private data? Is it confidential data? Is it public data? And the systems that transmit the data. Okay. The systems, because they run services to be able to transfer the data or store the data, their security implementation is required. Okay, so that's the first step, first thing that you do. Then you have to look at the baseline control. That's the minimum to protect that information. Maybe implementing encryption, right? For storage or web transfer, or web applications, or depending on the type of data. So I wouldn't want to implement encryption for public kind of data, but for confidential data, right? And then private data, what are you doing to that, right? Permission, privilege, access management. There's a lot of different things that goes into that particular piece in the checklist. Then if you want to develop the control to protect the information, you have to assess it. How good is the control, right? Can someone jeopardize your control? Is it done correctly? Does it meet the requirement? So you need to go back and audit it and assess it. Then you want to integrate that into your security plan, and so that way you can carry that out and determine if it meets, if it's effective, right? So in this part, we want to make sure that we design, develop, and implement the control to make sure that it fulfills the plan. So that entails establishing policies, rules, right? For your control, how it should be controlled, what, when, where, right? And then the procedures for that control to be in place, right? So number 4, that's really what it means. And then you're gonna carry that out based on your rules and your procedure. You're gonna implement it. Procedure just gives us step-by-step direction on how to do it, right? Where policy tells us what to do and what not to do with it. Then we are going to monitor to see how good it is, how bad it is, how effective it is, and that will take time. And then with that, you are going to look at the risk behind it. Every control has risk. It could be positive risk or negative risk, right? Some control will give you positive risk. Some control will give you negative risk. So for example, right, like I let's say that, I want to implement biometrics for access to all my systems for the agents, right? The people, the employee at the agency, right? You have to really think about like all of these steps. And then when you get here, you wanted to see how effective it is. There's false positive in fingerprint reader. How fast is it? What's the performance, right? Can someone access it without having the correct fingerprint? There's a lot of things to consider based on that. Then the risk behind that control. And then whether you can accept that risk or not, right? If it's a false positive system, yeah, I can accept to a certain level. If it's false negative, probably not, right? High level of false negative.
So that means that you and I can scan our finger and it sees you as me. That's not a good thing, right? And then we want to make sure that we continue to monitor that for changes and compliance. So these are the 9 things. 9 activities that is required for FISMA. Is that clear? Any question? Okay, so let's clarify the difference between NIST guidelines, which is what we've been talking about, the SP 800, compared to ISO. So when you take the CIS41D, you will revisit some of this area that we talked about. CIS41D is about advanced security practices, which carries into enterprise security integration, right, based on some guidance and standards. Okay, so you can go to page 14 and click those control, but if you want to summarize it so you understand it, you can do that as well. I don't need verbatim, right? Okay, so let's talk about ISO 27001. Whenever you go to now cloud conference, AI conference, they put AI on everything now, right? You see a lot of solutions, right? You see these booths and they will tell you, oh, we have ISO 2700, package where you can buy it and implement it in your company. Talk to us, right? So in cybersecurity, you can certify, right? Like, let's say that I implemented these things because I'm required to do it, but I want certification to validate that I fulfill the requirement. Okay? So NIST cybersecurity framework, as what we talked about earlier with the 9 activities, right? Is a self-certified framework where you would just do it and then you check yourself, you have the checklist and then you get a certification. Okay. You don't really need to pay someone to do it, but you do see a lot of security companies sell you the solution. They will be like, pay us, we'll do it for you, right? But you can do it, right? If you are already implementing it, you can self-certify. Now, ISO 27001 is globally accepted. So if you are a global company, right? If you have, let's say, storefront in Korea, like Costco or Walmart, right? China or McDonald's, right? You see McDonald's everywhere in the world. Your security implementation can be certified globally using ISO 27001. That's a key difference. The NIST framework is free, where ISO 27001 costs. There's a fee. Okay. Outside of if you pay a company to do it, there's a fee to get certified. Okay. So I put down additional information, like if you use like card payments like Visa, American Express, Discover, blah blah blah, right? MasterCard. If you don't pay a company to fulfill the requirement, right? A lot of the stores that you see, like when you go to 7-Eleven or gas station, when you use their POS, they buy that from a company that fulfills this, right? A lot of the time they contract it. So that way they don't have to go through the process for data security and that company does it. For our banks, financial company, they probably have to also fulfill this and then other criteria, and so on. Okay. Yeah.
So this is like certification or ISO is.
You can pay someone to do it for you, for sure, but it doesn't cost anything. So it's like, you know how there's DIY project where you can build a floor on your own, just do it, you learn as you do it, right? Or you can pay someone to build a floor for you, right? If you're not an expert in that, you don't know how, you don't have the people to do it, yeah, you can buy a solution from someone. But yeah, it doesn't cost anything if you do it yourself. And you can just go to the guidelines, the documentation to start working on that, right?
So
A certification that is globally recognized and it costs.
that's like both.
Both can cost, but the first option, it doesn't have to cost. It's not required to cost, but ISO, you have to pay. There's a fee. Yeah, so if you want to, because ISO require that you have an auditor that is outside of your company, an external auditor to come in and check, right? To see if those things are in place. Okay? And there is a fee to pay for that certification. You have to maintain it over time. So it is ideal for companies that already have security programs that is effective, that is in place, that they have maintained, because this will definitely secure the ISO certification based on what they have been doing, the credibility and the security measure. Okay. So, in my opinion, ISO might not, it's not for everybody, right? And even if you globally, you know, operating globally, you don't necessarily have the means to do ISO if your security plan is not mature or not well done or in a good place. Okay. Yeah, I used to, a lot of the conference I've been to of late or even before, you always see booths that advertise this for cloud, for all kinds of things. So they can sell you all of the things that they can implement, the software tools, the all the measure. They say, oh, we even sell you training packages for your users, annual training for awareness program, blah blah blah. So yeah. Security services is a big money business. So is insurance now, I hear, right? Okay. Any question? All right. If you missed it, this is going to be the last physical in-person requirement from me. Okay. Next week, you can come in to do the extra credit lab on deepfake if you don't want to do it outside. You don't have a system to do it outside. Monday, school will be closed for Memorial Day. So, if you have class on Monday, that's a holiday. I will be on campus on Tuesday, but I am typically in meetings on Tuesday. But I will be here in your scheduled time until the rest of the semester. Final exam will be released the second week or during the finals week. I will send out the announcement that Monday morning. Make sure you check it for passcode to exam, and I will use lockdown browser. If you want to come in here to take the exam, right, you can come in on a Wednesday because exam will close on Thursday night. I do not permit late exam, right, or practice exam because of timeline with grade submission, and some of you are graduating and transferring. I want to make sure that things get on your transcript accordingly. Practice exam got full offline because I couldn't automate my file into Canvas after like so many tries. So if I'm gonna attempt one more time tonight and tomorrow, if I'm successful, then it will go back up. But if not, I have to I do not want to manually copy and paste. I do a lot of things in Word as I write, right? As you can see. And then I put it up, but in Canvas quiz, it's a different element. And
Anyway, so it should be available by Friday, so that way you have a few weeks to work on it. Do not wait till the last day to do it. It's gonna give you 165 minutes. There's 85 questions, just like a regular exam, and they're 9 points each. Okay, so if you miss one, right, it'll just deduct 9 points. You do have multiple attempts, but the final exam is different, and final review will be available. You don't need to submit final review, right? So after I finish grading all of your assignments in lab, I know I'm a little behind, so I will try to catch up. So by going into next week, you should have a solid understanding of where you are and what you need to do on the practice and the final exam. Those are the two critical things at the end. There's some extra credit that's left, like core survey and the extra lab that we're gonna do. If you want to do it, you don't have to do it, right? And I'll try to record it if I have a little bit of time to post it. But that will be, this is our last official section. It feels so fast.
All right. Any question?